is in these papers by Cunliffe and Matzinger.
Okay, great. Fascinating stuff. And if I could have one follow-up, I'd love to hear Ray. I'm always very interested to hear him talk about the dead universe theory and biological fields, so I'll hang up. If there's anything he'd like to go into on that, I would be very interested to hear it. Thank you, Ray, and thank you, John.
All right, thanks a lot, Justin.
The which universe theory was it?
Justin, you gone? I think he said bio-universe, but I'm not sure. Are you having trouble hearing, Ray, on your end?
No, I just didn't get what kind of universe he said.
Maybe. Yeah, I don't want to speculate. Could it have been dead universe?
Oh, possibly. I can. Well, for example, if you want to look at another controversial video on the internet, Wallace or Wall Thornhill has some things on the electrical cosmos. I think his website is thunderbolt.com, if I remember.
Okay, that sounds interesting. We have another caller. Are you there, caller?
Oh, no, this is Justin again. I was just going to clarify. I was just talking about the notion that the universe was dead and inert, and most of biology was just kind of that nature. Do you understand what I'm saying, Ray?
I still didn't get the word. There was a bubble, right?
Oh yeah, he was saying that he was wondering about most of biology looks at the universe as being dead and inert and not a living system. Okay,
yeah. The field idea in biology, embryology as a model, developing according to its interactions with the environment, that idea continued. Some of the people who were developing experiments on trying to understand the rules by which an organism takes form, some of these people were vitalists who believed there was something extra besides the matter, but at least they were interested in the actual events as the organism took form. And they were knocked out of biology by the gene people, who I would say are on the side of an inert cosmos. They want to explain things in terms of essentially immaterial information, and they're the ones who talk about the vitalists wanting to introduce a vital principle as being somehow against the materialism of science, but the genetics people really want to depreciate the material world in favor of an information world, and the idea of the central dogma was that the information that we have in our genes is immortal and can't be added to, and it can only be written out into mortal, temporary, imperfect organisms, but it's the timeless stuff. So really the calling people like Driesch a vitalist and saying that they weren't really biologists, it's kind of self-referential, because the genetics people have thrown out most of the interesting stuff in biology until the last 10 years or so.
When they're starting to get back to the field theory again.
Yeah.
Did you get that, Justin?
Yes, I did. Thank you.
Okay.
And I'll hang up so someone else can get a question.
Okay, thanks a lot for calling.
All right. Bye.
All right, and the number again is 802-526-2326. And I do have some questions here. We get to them before we get busy. There's one from Brittany asking, let's see, if you are trying to self-treat for hypothyroid based upon blood tests and symptoms, how much T4 would be considered too much to take? And is T4 even necessary at all?
The problem with the commercialization of synthetic T4 that started in the late 40s was that they tested it on male medical students who are about 25 years old and selected for good health, and they found that it worked in them just like the real thyroid substance that had been in use for about 40, 50 years at that time.
Yeah.
And the trouble is that it then became commercialized, and women have at least 5 times the incidence of thyroid problems because of the antagonism between estrogen and thyroid. And the thyroid sluggishness that's so common in women shows up as a slow metabolism of the liver. Typically, a woman premenstrually will get drunk on a fraction of the alcohol that it takes to make a man drunk because the liver is slowed down by the antagonism between estrogen and thyroid and oxidative metabolism. And it happens that thyroxine has to be activated in the liver by taking off one of the iodines in the right position to make it the active hormone called T3. And so if women are having already low blood sugar symptoms or high estrogen symptoms, things that are the result of hypothyroidism, then T4 can very often not help or even make the problem worse. Some experimenters they were trying to argue that thyroid does something other than rev up the oxidative metabolism. So they took slices of muscle and kidney and liver and brain and heart and added thyroxine, T4, to these cultured slices, and saw that the liver had a tremendous burst of oxidative activity, but the kidneys didn't do much, and the muscles didn't do anything, and added to the brain, it actually suppressed oxidative metabolism in the brain. And so they said, you see, oxidation isn't what thyroid really does. It just happens that the liver responds that way. But they were looking at the pre-hormone. The liver has to turn it into the active hormone before it can work in the muscles, kidneys, heart, and brain. And what it turns out that the brain concentrates, the blood can have 40 times as much T4 as T3 if your liver is a little sluggish, and your brain will still concentrate the T3 to the point that it has a 1-to-1 ratio. And so if you put the brain slice in a dish where it can't get a new supply of T3 constantly, the added T4 can't do anything except displace some of the active hormone that the brain had been concentrating at the 1-to-1 ratio. So adding T4 to the brain in the culture dish, it caused suppression of metabolic activity. And in people, you very often see it causing neurological symptoms, strange electrical sensations or ringing ears or worse memory, various things that are really signs of worse thyroid function.
So it sounds like T4 probably is not you shouldn't be taking very much of it, if any at all, especially if you're a woman.
Yeah, it's very good if you don't need it very much.
So a lot of people take a mixture of T4 and T3, supposedly close to the physiological dose of 1 to 5, I think it is.
Well, the gland, if you take a human gland or a cow gland, it's close to a 4-to-1 ratio.
Okay. And is that a good mixture to take if you were supplementing your thyroid with it?
Yeah, even a 5-to-1 mixture is okay. But the people who were insisting on still using the Armour with its 4-to-1 ratio in the 1960s, as the pharmaceutical companies developed tests for diagnosing thyroid, they started noticing that the people who were taking thyroxine had maybe a 40-to-1 ratio of T4 to T3 in the blood, but the people who were taking Armour had maybe a 10-to-1 or a 5-to-1 ratio, and so they defined the people who were taking T4 as the normal, and the ones who were taking Armour as having too much T3. But most doctors at that time weren't aware at all that T3 was the thyroid hormone.
Oh, I see. So they jumped to conclusions, and we're still stuck with some of those conclusions.
Yeah, one of the ideas that spread quickly in the late 1940s, when the first blood tests for thyroid came on the market around the same time as Synthroid, the T4 product. It was the protein-bound iodine test, and where people like Broda Barnes had seen close to half of the population benefiting from some thyroid, which used to be part of the meat supply until the agriculture department said the meat companies could no longer sell it. But in Broda Barnes' time, he saw that somewhere between 20 and 45% of the people benefited from taking some thyroid. But these new blood tests in the late 40s found that 95% of the people had a fairly high level of iodine bound to protein in the blood. And that created the only 5% need a thyroid supplement idea.
I see.
But then by the 1960s, new tests came about, and they realized that the protein-bound iodine test had almost nothing to do with thyroid function, really nothing to do with thyroid function. So the standard that still persists widely, that not only 5% of the population is potentially a candidate for supplement, the basis for establishing that had nothing to do with the thyroid function.
Yeah, I'm beginning to see that that's a common problem in science, is that basically conclusions get set in stone and then they never get revisited again.
Yeah.
Lilia asks, there was a follow-up question to that last one. Let me just get that before I move on, because I'll lose it. Hang on a second. Let me find that. This is also... hang on just a minute. Oh, here it is. Yes, it was an undigested food question. If you tend to constantly have excessive air, chest pressure, or feeling the need to burp, is that a sign of low stomach acid with undigested food causing problems, or too much stomach acid? And what would you do about it, if you have any idea?
Basically, no. A lot of different things can cause that. Some people can actually have reverse peristalsis. When you analyze burps, most of the time it's air that you've swallowed coming back, just plain perfect air. But sometimes you find other gases, such as methane, coming out in burps. And Walter Alvarez, one of the interesting things he demonstrated was that it's pretty common for people to experience very intense reverse peristalsis. He put some lycopodium powder in his medical students' rectums when they went home for the evening.
I'm beginning to get the idea that I wouldn't have wanted to be in his medical class.
And he had them fill out a questionnaire saying whether they typically experienced morning breath. And then when they came in the morning after getting the lycopodium powder, he took a swab in their mouth and found lycopodium powder in the mouths of the ones who typically had bad breath in the morning.
Wow. That's a little grim. I hope they didn't have girlfriends or boyfriends. So, but you think most of the time the air is just from the burping is just from swallowing air, most likely?
Yeah, in the daytime. Most of the reverse peristalsis happens in the night.
All right.
If you're low thyroid, your autonomic nervous system tends to rev up, compensating for the low oxidative metabolism. It pushes it harder to increase your adrenaline in particular. Some of the other things, histamine and serotonin, go up too. But the adrenaline tends to stop the forward propulsion of the peristalsis, and then random signals, irritation from something in your intestine, can probably send waves going both directions. And that probably is more common when your digestive system is slightly paralyzed by a very high adrenaline level.
Yeah. All right. Sheila asks, what are your thoughts on multiple sclerosis? What causes it, and how do you think it should best be treated?
In the 70s, I saw a series of 5 people over a period of just maybe, a year or two, I think. And as they told me their symptoms, I said, that sounds like classical hypothyroidism. And a couple of these people went to their old-fashioned doctors with a list of what they had just told me that their symptoms were, and said, here are my symptoms, what do I have? And the doctor said, hypothyroidism, and gave them thyroid. And that series of 5 people in a row, every one of them discovered they didn't have multiple sclerosis, but rather just needed a thyroid supplement.
The same person asks, and this is definitely related, why do I feel bad after I accidentally took too much desiccated thyroid? She increased it a little too fast over the course of a couple weeks, and she actually managed to get some raw thyroid from a butcher, which is interesting because that's something I've been trying to do for a while unsuccessfully. And she would like to know, how long does it usually take for the thyroid to get back to normal when you stop eating it? And is there anything to do about it getting to feel better quicker?
Well, people probably worry too much about it. The T4 has a half-life of 2 weeks, and T3 in different people can have a half-life as short as 1 day. And so if you were getting a sudden overdose and your pulse went up maybe 150 beats per minute at rest, in 48 hours, probably you would have lost at least half of your T3, which is the active stuff, and your liver would then be putting out just sort of a disposal amount, converting the T4 to T3. So usually, if you took so much that you had a very fast 150 beat heart rate, in 2 days you would probably be down to a fairly safe, comfortable 120 beats per minute.
I see. And if you wanted to intervene and make that even a quicker transition?
Oh, yeah. I've seen some people who just suddenly spontaneously became hyperthyroid, or who had overdosed. Juicing cabbage raw, it just takes a glass or two of that to very powerfully suppress your thyroid functions. It worked at several levels, but usually a glass or two a day for a couple of days, and the person is back down to normal.
And once you suppress... go ahead.
Well, liver is another suppressive food. If you eat 2 big meals of liver, you can see a big decrease in thyroid function.
And how long does that suppression last from liver or cabbage? If you eat something and say you're not hyperthyroid, you're just normal, whatever that is, and you eat some liver, how long does it take for your thyroid to bounce back? Is that also just a matter of a couple days?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the fear of suppressing your thyroid gland itself by taking too much thyroid, that has been tested by using isotopes that they could tell where the thyroid was coming from. So they would dose them until they could tell there was no thyroid being produced by their own gland, and then they stopped dosing them to see if there was any concern about prolonged suppression. And everyone's gland came right back in a couple of days.
Well, that's encouraging. So you can supplement your thyroid without fear of permanently taking it out of the system, which I think is what a lot of people are told if they talk to their doctor about it.
Yeah, and the farmers who had their own animals, often they would eat the thyroid gland in the chicken neck, for example. And one guy I knew said that on Friday they always had fried chicken in the field for lunch, and he said Friday afternoons he was always too hot to work, but he would eat 5 necks and get probably 20 grains of thyroid or so.
Oh yeah.
A very suppressive dose, and he would be very hot, but by the next day it would have passed.
Huh. That'll get you moving. There's another thyroid question here from Wade. I would like to ask Ray's thoughts on reverse T3. If it is really necessary to use T3 treatment only to clear out the accumulated reverse T3, or if a combination thyroid product and proper nutrition will resolve the issue.
Yeah, I think it's mostly caused by high cortisol and stress hormones. And so just eating a good supportive diet, plenty of fruit, orange juice and milk, will help keep the stress down. And I think it works just as effectively as taking just small amounts of T3.
And what causes reverse T3? It's basically where your whole thyroid system shuts down. Is that right?
Yeah. If you if your body thinks that you're having an overexposure to thyroid, it gets rid of the excess by turning thyroxine into an inactive kind of T3. It takes off the wrong iodine. And so if you're fasting, for example, part of the thyroid is being excreted the way estrogen or toxins are being excreted all the time, but part of it is being inactivated in a way that has an anti-thyroid effect. it interferes with the active T3, so it's an extra fast way to turn off your thyroid function. Not just getting rid of the active stuff, but making a neutralizing, blocking form of the thyroid.
And I missed part of the question of the person who was concerned about MS, and that had to do with a drug to decrease the number of MS symptoms, and I think it's called, just can't find the word here, naloxone, or do you know what?
Yeah, naloxone or naltrexone.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you.
So, when you're under stress, you produce the endorphins, and the endorphins they compensate for injury or stress, and they should go away, but prolonged stress can leave you sort of inhibited in various ways with the wrong pattern of endorphins. And if a person has been exposed to prolonged stress, sometimes you can break out of that pattern and recover functions with an anti-morphine treatment. These naloxone and naltrexone are the injected and oral forms of an anti-opiate that simply keeps the morphine or the endorphin from having its effect, and sometimes that can restore functions that had been suppressed.
And it sounds like you've opined that you don't like opiates, or that you think they're actually bad for you in the long run, and so that sounds like it's not a bad thing to be taking.
Yeah, I think it usually has its effect in just a few days, though.
I see.
And I think if it hasn't really made a big difference in just a few days, then it's probably some other problem.
I see. So if you wanted to keep the inflammation low, could you just use some other anti-inflammatory? Oh
yeah. All kinds of stabilizing anti-inflammatory things. Thyroid and progesterone and the short-chain fatty acids and sugars are all things that help restore injured, demyelinated nerves.
Well, let me ask before I go into my own questions. And the phone number again is 802-526-2326, 802-526-2326, if anybody wants to call. And you can Skype me at John Barkhausen, all one word. Lilia asks, do you, Ray, have any thoughts on the efficacy of prolotherapy, in which a solution containing sugar in the form of dextrose is injected into tendons or ligaments to strengthen weakened connective tissue, tissue that was weakened as the result of injury? Have you ever heard of that?
Oh, yeah. My father had it done. I think they used vegetable oil in the 1950s. A combination of Novocaine and vegetable oil, I think, was the popular thing then. And it causes an inflammatory reaction and toughening up of the ligaments, and it can cure some back problems without anything very invasive, just a shot into the ligament. And so it's proven to work, but I think there are better things. It's usually a low DHEA production from low thyroid, high estrogen, and stress hormones that cause the ligaments and tendons to get weak. And the correcting the thyroid function and maybe taking a DHEA or pregnenolone supplement would be the natural way to strengthen the ligaments and tendons, and it helps the bones at the same time.
Okay. I guess the person who did this did find relief from it, and she'd been suffering for 35 years, so it sounds like there's a couple ways to fix that problem. And I was going to ask you, I know people wonder when they hear you talk. By the way, we are talking to Dr. Raymond Peat, who's a PhD in biology with a specialization in physiology from Eugene, Oregon, and he also has vast knowledge of science history. And we have about half an hour to go here at WMRW LP Warren, and we are having a fundraiser, by the way. I keep forgetting to mention it, but if you'd like to contribute to alternative radio, radio that doesn't have commercial conscriptions, feel free to do that at any time at WMRW.org. You can click the pig to make a PayPal or credit card donation, and we're trying to raise our $10,800 annual operating budget, which is not much money to run a radio station. And that's because nobody here is paid a salary. Thanks for putting up with that, Ray. Let's see. I wanted to ask you, a lot of times it sounds like all of our problems boil down to having a slow metabolism, or basically the engine that drives us and gives us all of our energy is not running well. And I've heard the complaint about your writings before that all he ever thinks is wrong with us is our thyroid, and somehow that's a put down. How do you respond to that?
Well, it doesn't apply just to people. It applies to all complex organisms, practically.
Mm-hmm.
The difference between us and a fungus is that we've had a lot of thyroid and oxidative metabolism that the fungus hasn't benefited from. All of our functions are characterized by high energy oxidative metabolism, the brain more than any other part. And as you look at the animal kingdom, the outstanding thing is that their oxidative metabolism increases as they go up the so-called evolutionary scale. And it's that oxygen is driving our existence, and our existence is culminating in a bigger, more expensive brain that other animals couldn't afford because their thyroid function wasn't adequate. It's really the essential thing, given oxygen and sugar and a few other materials. Thyroid is the catalyst for making things run right.
Mm-hmm. And it's, I mean, when people complain that all you, and I don't think it's actually true, but when they say that all you talk about is the thyroid, they make it sound like you're not interested in any of the other systems of the body, but the thyroid does seem like the master system in terms of energy production for everything.
Yeah, and if your thyroid, for example, is working efficiently, then your pituitary doesn't have much to do, and you aren't likely to get a pituitary tumor. Your adrenals don't have much to do. Your ovaries don't get overstimulated. The other glands have an easy job when your thyroid is working right. If your thyroid gets interfered with, then you've got to rev up your adrenals, and then your pituitary becomes a commander-in-chief and tells everyone what to do.
With the stress hormones.
Yeah, and then you're at risk of getting tumors of the ovaries or testicles or adrenal glands or thyroid gland because your pituitary is working them too hard.
That's a good way to look at it. I also wanted to, in lieu of anybody else calling in, I have some questions about common problems. A lot of people have arthritis, and we've discussed that a little bit today. But in our shows about progesterone, you were talking about several instances where progesterone was very helpful to women with arthritis. But what about men? Is it the right substance to use for men in arthritis?
Yeah, one of the first people I gave it to was a friend over 40 years ago, I think, who every afternoon his knee swelled up, obviously rheumatoid arthritis. It looked like a football. And I just got some standard injectable progesterone from the drugstore, and he put the whole vial on, rubbed it from his side down to his calf. And 2 or 3 hours later, he was walking and showed me his knee was no longer swollen. And just about 3 or 4 years ago, he was still walking without a limp. I hadn't noticed arthritis in all that time.
So for people developing arthritis in their hands now, is that also a thyroid problem, do you think, or is it just some inflammation that could be taken care of with aspirin or progesterone? Yeah, when your thyroid is down, you compensate with all kinds of other stress hormones. Your autonomic system goes up, but so does your adrenal, cortical, and aldosterone hormones. Estrogen increases, even melatonin gets involved. Everything runs to compensate when the thyroid is low. And some of these compensatory things don't quite compensate fully, and then they get involved in creating the inflammation. And that's where the DHEA and progesterone, either taken orally or can be applied topically, those are the things that are deficient, that as a consequence, the other more delicate and dangerous hormones such as estrogen and cortisol, those increase because you're low in progesterone, DHEA, and pregnenolone. And so supplementing any of those three or all three of them will usually alleviate or cure arthritis. I've known people with dogs or horses, they thought that the horse was so old that it would never work again. And just giving it progesterone, they made the horse healthy and happy for several more years. And people with dogs that basically couldn't walk around, couldn't get up on the furniture, they gave them pregnenolone or progesterone, and they were their normal test selves. That's great. We have a caller. You're on the air, caller.
Hi. Thanks for taking my call. Ray, in your essay on autonomic systems, there's a little passage about 20th century writing and painting, and you talk about those things being considered expressive rather than communicative. I was wondering if you could give some examples of 20th century writers or painters who you think are communicative and not insane, and as someone maybe who is following in Blake's footsteps.
I missed several parts of those sentences. John, could you repeat them?
I'm not sure if I got them all either. Could you try again, caller, and I'll turn the volume up so maybe Ray will get it.
Okay, I'm sorry. It might be my cell phone's fault. I was just wondering if there are any 20th century writers or painters who you consider not insane, who you consider communicative rather than expressive. Oh. Maybe somebody who's following in Blake's footsteps.
Somebody who's following in Blake's footsteps.
Yeah. Siqueiros was one of my heroes, David Alfaro Siqueiros.
How do you spell that?
Siqueiros.
Okay, thanks.
And why did you originally say that, Ray, that the 20th century artists are considered to be out of their minds?
Well, they were driven out of their minds partly by the CIA's project called the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which worked with Nelson Rockefeller to glorify some of the what Siqueiros called them, the ghost artists. They were creating a culture of anti-culture, and the CIA knew exactly what they were doing, and presumably Nelson Rockefeller did too, when he and his two or three other philanthropists concentrated on these people because of their antisocial consciousness. And they ridiculed the idea that art should have a social consciousness. And the CIA pumped Marshall Plan money into creating this alternative culture of abstract expressionism and such.
Sounds like we need to start a new show called Politics and Art. Yeah, corrupting influence of money everywhere. Do you have another comment, caller?
Okay, no, thank you. I'll get off now. Bye.
Okay, thanks for calling.
I'm not sure. I think it was just because Siqueiros was working around the New York crowd that he saw what was happening. It was years later before the actual facts became public. I think it was 1968 when this CIA financing of culture was revealed. But Siqueiros had been there seeing it going on. So he was the first person I heard of writing about the government's official ghost culture.
Yeah, that's. And what do you think the government's motive was for doing that, Ray? Was it just to divorce people from the
to improve the power? Yeah, to improve the power of the Rockefeller class by keeping anyone who said art should be socially conscious, show them to be some kind of degenerate or subversive.
We just got another email question in. It's to ask you what causes moles on the skin.
I'm not sure what you would say causes them, but I've, in myself and in several friends, I found that they were very hormonally related. In about 1980, one summer, I had been watching a mole grow on my belly, and it was obviously, to me, becoming a dangerous melanoma. it had grown from a little brown spot to
Hello?
Can you just keep it down while Ray answers this question? There's some... turn off your mic for a second.
Okay.
It was becoming an obvious melanoma to me, and a couple of doctors who happened to be visiting that summer saw it and told me that they thought it was a melanoma. But around that time, I was experimenting with different steroids, and I just happened to be tasting some DHEA around that time, and without thinking of any connection, one night I noticed a shiny red dome on my belly where the mole had been. And over the next 3 or 4 days, the mole disappeared. And thinking about it, I realized that I had been sampling the DHEA around that time. So the next time I started getting a mole that looked like it was turning into a melanoma, for example, turning blue and white, and the blue and white spots swimming around or changing positions rapidly, typical behavior of a melanoma, I would just apply a little either progesterone or DHEA to that area, and immediately the color, instead of swimming around in colored spots, would level out and become just a little tan-colored thing, and then it would go away. And I had a series of experiments. One was a mole as big as a jumbo olive that when I finally put some progesterone near it, within 2 weeks it had turned to a crisp and fallen off without leaving a trace of a scar.
Wow. Where
this huge black thing had been. And I found that I could sort of steer them. They're extremely mobile, the pigment cells. A huge black thing appeared suddenly on my lower arm, and having the other experiences, I put a dot of progesterone in oil on the upside, about an inch from the spot.
Is that coconut
and
oil?
The next day there were, I think it was vitamin E and progesterone.
Okay, thanks.
And the following day there was a shadow of it about an inch downstream towards my hand, and I put another dot on, and each time I put a dot on, the next day there would be a shadow an inch farther down. So I had a series of 3 or 4 progressively fainter shadows, and each time a shadow moved out from it, the spot itself got fainter, and pretty soon all of the cells had walked away from the big black spot. And in another case, putting a dot on the front of one on my forehead, the pigment cells moved out in a circumference away from it. So it looked, on the third day, it looked like a bullseye. And after about a week, the original spot had shrunk up and pinched off at the base.
Wow.
And left no scar.
That's phenomenal.
Various other people who didn't experiment in such detail would just take an overdose of thyroid for a week or two, and day by day you could see their mole shrinking until, in one case, a mole an inch long disappeared from a guy's back in 2 weeks.
So you were just toying with it, with that progesterone and pregnenolone.
Yeah, very entertaining to see how fast these cells can run through your body.
Yeah.
People have studied them on cover slips, and at 90 degrees, which is the average skin temperature, a cell of that type can walk about an inch per day.
Wow.
If it's motivated.
if you've got something to move it along. No loitering.
Yeah.
We have
I think the reason I think the reason they collect in certain spots is that they come looking for something that's missing from where they were.
They're looking for some resource to take advantage of, or?
Yeah, like they found some cell that was emitting DHEA possibly.
Oh.
And so everyone moved in to take advantage.
Huh. I see. And that's maybe what caused the mole to form in the first place.
Yeah, some people just the last couple of months have been thinking about the factors that guide cell migration, and it's probably going to be a very interesting field in the next few years, trying, for example, to lure cancer cells back from their metastatic positions, call them back to where they should be.
That sounds much more civilized than what they do now. We do have a caller, Ray, and not very much time left, so
okay.
Caller, if you want to turn on your mic.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks for doing that. And what's your question?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome, and how it causes, goes together with low testosterone, and what's the best way to attack that.
Okay, we have about 7 minutes.
I've got some newsletters specifically on that, but getting the polyunsaturated fats out of your body as far as possible, or keeping them in storage if they're there, but definitely avoiding all kinds of polyunsaturated fats, because those are the things that specifically interfere with the ability to oxidize glucose. One of the reasons that aspirin for 100 years has been known to help lower blood sugar in that kind of diabetes is that aspirin does several things to interrupt the effects of the polyunsaturated fats. It keeps them from turning into the inflammation-causing prostaglandins, but it also helps to keep them in storage where they don't do any harm, or not so much harm.
All right. Caller, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you for that. And I wanted to know, would that also, correlate into the weight loss? Because I found that, as soon as weight is lost, the blood sugar starts regulating itself.
Yeah, the fat cells are sending out signals that create inflammation. Leptin is one of the pro-inflammatory signals that you want to signal your fat to stop sending leptin if possible.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks for calling.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. We have one more question that came in by email, Ray, and it says, it's from Jerry. I eat raw vegetables out of the garden all summer. Is that a no-no? I always thought raw veggies were more nutritious than cooked.
It depends on what they are. Like peppers, for example, are really fruits. Tomatoes and peppers are good raw. And carrots and some of the radishes, for example, are, if you ate a lot of them, they would be anti-thyroid. But there are some things called vegetables that are really fairly rich in sugar as well as the minerals, and so those sweetish root vegetables are pretty healthy, and the fruits, tomatoes and bell peppers in particular.
As long as you're not nightshade intolerant.
Yeah, the allergy to those is a problem for a lot of people.
You're not very big on some raw vegetables, is that right? Like beans and such?
Yeah, the raw stuff, it's likely to feed bacteria and cause problems. And if there is a seed developing in it, that has other specific toxins. Like peas and beans are not so great.
Yeah. And I really wanted to ask you about eczema. I was wondering if you had any tips for how to handle that. We only have a couple minutes.
Keeping your intestine in good condition is one of the things. Both eczema and psoriasis tend to flare up in a lot of people when they eat bread